This channel is supported by TrueFire. TrueFire is an online library of lessons from some of my favourite players. There's thousands of lessons on there. You can use the promo code JNC40 to get 40% off of any of their courses. So yesterday I was making a video for G66 about using Fractal FM3 basically as sort of like a pedal board type thing and thinking about the flexibility of it. And it made me today want to try just plugging the Fractal FM3 as basically like a reverb and delay unit into the back of my Mesa Boogie Nomad. I also tried it into the Carolan Tucana. And it just basically reminded me of like how much more convenient and quick to use this stuff is than a traditional kind of pedal board setup. Now, generally, I think we tend to think of like pedals as simpler than modelers to use for, you know, various reasons. You've got your knobs on them and stuff like that. But I think once you start to go down the route of thinking about controlling things with MIDI and having things foot switchable, potentially with, you know, one foot switch changing a lot of things at a time, I think very quickly you get into a situation where you've created sort of a little bit of a MIDI nightmare, right? I guess probably you've been there as well. So I've tried to sort of like program Strymon timelines and stuff like that to change patches with another MIDI device like an HX Stomp or something. These things take time. You have to read manuals and bits and pieces like that. And now I imagine if you then try to extend that so that it's switching another device at the same time that potentially might be from another manufacturer, say you had like an Empress Reverb or something like that, then you're going to have to open up another manual. It just makes me think like this modeler based kind of multi-effects thing, for me, I feel like has got to be the way to go. And it's seeming to me like this is sort of the route that some of the pedal people have started to go down, like the Meris LVX. Now I had a Meris LVX, and again, using that because it's got a screen on it seemed more familiar than doing stuff with a Strymon. But by the time that you think about actually getting to use the Meris LVX, think about some of what it can do, there's almost nothing that it can do that I couldn't already do with like a Fractal FM3 or a Line 6 HX effect. And, you know, by the time that you're starting to put these effects together and stuff like that, to me, I think that nothing really beats just having a modeler, you know, whether it's Fractal or Line 6 in the loop for this kind of stuff. There are other considerations as well. So that's kind of one that I feel like if you consider the amount of time that it might take to program, you know, one of these more intelligent pedal boards. I mean, if you're using a straightforward, simple kind of pedal board setup, like maybe you just got a drive, an analog delay, that sort of stuff, I think for that kind of situation, probably you're absolutely fine just going through that, and maybe you have like a simple gig rig Quartermaster or something like that. But once you start going down the route of maybe the more expensive MIDI controllers, so something like the gig rig Atom, these kind of things, or G3, or I think this Caveman Audio is like a MIDI controller that the Edge and David Gilmour use. I think by that point you start to get into this situation where everything is going to take, I imagine, a lot more time to program in than just figuring out how a modeler works. I really knock up against this when I try some of these other devices, like say I try the Empress Reverb or the Strymon Big Sky and stuff. They're quite simple to start off with, and then you think about, right, I want to program in an expression pedal to do a certain thing, or, you know, these different bits and pieces, or, you know, I want to switch between presets and know confidently what's happening. All of these things are really, really simple on a modeler because you've got a screen and an interface designed to do these things. Whereas with the Strymon stuff, with the Impress stuff, as good as it is, you still have to then reference like a manual. And I don't know how many of you remember some of the kind of startup functions and stuff like that. So with the Strymon Cloudburst, if you wanted to program in certain things, you have to kind of turn it on and remember what buttons do what, because you've got no screen to just do things that would be relatively simple on a modeler like the Fractal FM3 or anything from Line 6. So time and convenience, I think, are a huge factor. I think cost is one where you look at something like the Fractal FM3 and you think, right, well, that's quite expensive, like £1,200. Maybe that's expensive sounding because it's kind of a one-off, you pay that. But if you think about, say, the Strymon trifecta, so you've got your Timeline, you've got your Big Sky, and you've got your Mobius. So those could do more or less some of what a Fractal FM3 could do, for instance. Now you think about the cost of that would be £450 for the Big Sky, £400 for the Timeline, and then probably £350 or something for the Mobius. You've easily racked up the cost of the Fractal FM3. You've easily racked up 3 times the cost of like a Line 6 device. I certainly don't think most people these days don't think that the Fractal stuff keeps up with Strymon, and I personally feel like the more recent Line 6 stuff keeps up with Strymon as well. But not only that, if you then had to program those 3 Strymons to work together, you've set yourself up quite a bit of work reading through manuals and figuring out your MIDI controllers, and probably you need a MIDI controller to program these things anyway. So then what would you get? Something by Morningstar or something like that. And so I really think that the way forward, for me at least, and I don't know if you're the same, you know, people like The Edge, people like Steve Vai, John Petrucci, they're already using this stuff live anyway. And I think we're getting a little bit back to that scenario where I think like in the 80s, 90s, the Bradshaw kind of rack system but it's now kind of just in your digital modeler, and those kinds of complex routings and those kind of complex setups where you've got things changing all at the same time are just super easy, and super easy to program in expression pedals and stuff like that. And I think it's just a more cost-effective way, as well as being able to do more ambitious stuff, I find. So if you had a bog standard kind of MIDI controller, can that generally change effects routing? I don't think so. I think the gig rig can do some of that stuff, but again, if you try and program in a thing without a screen, it tends to me to take way longer. So for me, I think it's just, it doesn't seem like there's a way around this, where if you're not doing a relatively simple pedal board, where the modular kind of approach wins for me every single time. And I know that's a bias of mine anyway. And one thing that I would still potentially keep would be kind of analog drives up front if you're doing that sort of thing. But as I said in the video yesterday, I went to Real World and I had a modular in the loop of my amplifier because I needed time-based effects stuff and kind of per song stuff. And I find that I used to do this on the Kemper as well, that you just program in a thing per song and you know what the BPMs are going to be, so you can just program out in. It's just super easy, and you've got the reference on screen. I find dialing in these kind of complex digital effects without the help of a screen now, you know, and a proper interface to interact with, I find way more difficult, and it just takes so much more time, I've found. I think one area that there might be a perceived compromise would be tone-wise. I think some people have it in mind that if you buy one effect pedal, that necessarily that's going to have better digital converters and all that sort of stuff. But the other benefit of using something like this is that you've actually only got the one conversion happening, whereas if you had the Strymon Mobius and the Timeline, you've got two conversions happening then. And yeah, I don't know, it's just, it makes sense that having one unit doing all of your reverbs, delays, that sort of stuff would be probably cleaner in terms of signal as well, because you've only got that one conversion happening. It also depends on the quality of your effects loop. So the Nomad doesn't have a great effects loop. I think it's parallel, but even so, it's easy to get kind of inspiring with this expression pedal. I can get rid of the kind of shimmery stuff and just go to having just a straight plate reverb. And you think about what would you do with a traditional pedal board to achieve just that simple thing that I had there. So what I've got going on there is like a diffusion type delay, and that is basically on its own path controlled by a volume pedal. So if you think about that, you'd need a board capable probably of doing some kind of parallel routing, and there's also a reverb there. So even those two things alone are sort of semi-complicated, right? As simple as it sounds, it's kind of not with the traditional pedal board. What else have I got going in this preset? Also the kind of crystal pitch echoes thing. So you'd need something like a Strymon Timeline or an Eventide pitch factor, or like an Eventide H9. Then you'd need something that can do diffused reverb, so something like an Empress Ecosystem or Strymon Timeline. And then a reverb pedal, so something that could do like a plate, or, you know, stereo plate, or something that can do cloud reverb. So I think the best kind of choice for that in some ways would still be something like the Empress Reverb or the Strymon Big Sky. And you think the cost of that already would be quite high. And then to be able to do the parallel kind of thing, you'd need some sort of A/B dry wet box thing, right? It's just, even these really simple things that on the face of it with a modeler are super simple, you just have an A signal path and a B signal path and join them up. In the real world with real cables, and this is the other thing, you know, buying a pedal board, buying a power supply, buying all of the cables to patch this stuff up. Although I get totally like the tangible nature and the cool stuff about a pedal board, and I think it harks back to some of our childhood stuff, you know, building things can be really fun. I do still think it wouldn't be anywhere near as quick, convenient, or repeatable as something like an effects pedal like this, because I can just save this preset and then, you know, in future I come back to it, it'll be exactly the same. With a pedal board, you have to keep the pedal board up together to be able to replicate what happened, and as soon as you start to break up a pedal board that has all of these kind of MIDI complicating factors, I imagine that is a nightmare. So I don't know if you ever put together a MIDI pedal board or a rack system, or are you a pedal board kind of fanatic, or someone who really just loves pedals so much that you wouldn't ever consider this route? I'd love to hear from you as well. Ways that you've achieved this sort of thing. I think Joey Landreth was the inspiration for this kind of thing, where you've got something that you can bring in this sort of pool of really cool, lush reverb and delay sounds with something like an expression pedal, and his pedal board is incredibly complex and expensive, and I thought, well, this would be super easy to achieve on a modeler, and so I thought, well, I'll try and do that. I just think for me, I can't think of a situation where, unless it's a super simple board, you know, just a straightforward drive, all this sort of stuff, that it wouldn't be more flexible, cheaper, and more versatile and more reliable to go down this route. I don't know, let me know your thoughts. Unless you end up with an amp without an effects loop, that could be an issue. But I guess that in that case, you'd have some analog drives up front, maybe, or you could even use drives on the actual things. But I think, yeah, I don't know. Let me know your thoughts.